All right, so welcome back to Inside Access Control. I'm excited today to have somebody outside of our industry come in to talk a little bit about some of the phase changes that we've been talking about, especially for those of you that recently got my newsletter. It was a conversation around innovation inside of a crisis, which we're currently in now, and the strategic thinking that people are doing that they use when coming out of these things. So one of those areas reached out to a local organization here in the DC metro area that come to find out I've known for years from their days of some products, which we'll talk about on that end. But Wolf Ruzicka, thank you very much for joining. He's from EastBanc Technology.
Of course, and thank you for having me, Lee. My name is Wolf Ruzicka. I'm the chairman of EastBanc Technologies. We build software products for other people. Sometimes we build them for ourselves. One of those is what Lee was referring to, an API management system that ultimately Microsoft acquired from us in this now called Microsoft Azure API Management. So many of you have interacted with the software that we've built without even knowing that we exist.
So yeah, so in looking at your company, a lot of topics, everything from AI to edge computing, the rest. I thought what we would was we'd focus on now some of the trends that we were talking about in our industry, like touchless technology and cloud and client server, and they're starting to now go from being a nice to have to actually now a must have, right, in a lot of ways now with what's going on. So talk to me a little about, if I'm an organization that wants to do that, I'm a believer that it needs to be hybrid, right, where you have things on the edge computing and then going to the cloud when you need to. There's a lot of people in the industry that believe that way. But if I want to really get into that, what do I need to do? Like if I wanted to start, I want big data, I want touchless, I want edge compute, all that we could play the bingo of,
I want it all.
I want it all. But where do I start?
Of course, you have to dream big, but start as small as you possibly can. And I agree with you that there's a hybrid approach to these types of hosting environments. You have to be as close as you can computer-wise to the actual interaction, and then do the massive computations in the background. That's for sure the type of landscape that I would recommend thinking about. But in all of it, I would start as small as I can. So I would think about what we would call in the software product development world an MVP, a minimal viable product. As far as data is concerned, we've started coining the term of a minimal viable prediction. So start gathering the smallest possible data point that you can ensure is accurate data. You don't have to start with big data. Start with as small as possible, an accurate data set, and then iterate from there. And what we're trying to do with all of this, like any good startup and any good software product tries to do, is to invoke compounding. So if you then get accurate data and you are able to invoke a positive action towards your interaction touchless with somebody, iterate from there. And as you then iterate more and more and more often, you hopefully start gathering a hockey stick as far as the data volumes are concerned. But you're creating data breadcrumbs where every single one of those data breadcrumbs, every single one of those interactions, you can get it wrong. But the risk of getting it wrong doesn't bring the entire architecture down. It doesn't bring your entire reputation with your end users down. It just creates a little bit of a possible risk. And so ultimately, you really want to try to create a risk and mitigate this risk, be it in data volume. Start as small as you can. Start with as few interactions as you can. Start with as few moving pieces as you can, so that you ultimately get to this one killer feature that really validates your theory of this big thing that we were just talking about, of on-premises, in the cloud, somewhere in between, touchless and interactive, intelligent versus manual. So this is my suggestion on approaching it. Which then really means your budget outlays, the time that you need to invest in order to validate your theory behind it is tiny, and then you iterate from there.
Now, your typical engagements that you have, what is the typical person that you're working with? Is there a typical product manager? Are they a data scientist that works there? Is it
If I use the current situation and move it back in time to a similar type of crises in a certain industry, maybe that's a good example of how I would approach it and who we typically work with. So media industry, think of when Google News, Vox, BuzzFeed, and all of these kinds of media and news disruptors came to the scene. Who were the ones that were really in a crisis? Were the traditional newspaper businesses, the typical media businesses, the more legacy type of businesses. But they were running out of budgets very, very quickly. So you needed to, again, start as small as you can, but you also start extremely high in the hierarchy because that's where the sense of urgency is probably the highest. So in this case, I'm referring to the Washington Post, and I'm referring to Shailesh Prakash, the CIO at the Washington Post. That was before Jeff Bezos bought them. And we needed to transform jointly into a technology company that happens to have a newsroom full of reporters that produces content. So how do you go about that when budgets are extremely small, when timelines are extremely aggressive, and when you're really at threat of being eaten alive, that you won't survive the next industry innovation? We started with surrounding the existing legacy systems with tiny modules that either gather data or allowed content to be distributed out. And so again, each of those modules doesn't really pose an existential risk as far as budget, time, careers is concerned. And we made it. So now you go to the Washington Post, you're looking at one of the most modern software technology companies, probably in the media industry. And how is that proven? Because they turned that software that we jointly created into a product that they now license out to the former competitors and current competitors. And the Washington Post software powers their own competitors as with the type of software product thinking that we jointly created. So long story short, you start as high as you can, you start as small as you can.
And I also like the fact that something you said in there that jumped out to me is I think a lot of times people view this as a feature, but you talked about it as a product. And
Yes.
treating it like a product, I believe, then it gets the proper attention and probably how it's handled is just better than if it's just a feature. So prioritization, budget wise, the rest of it. So
You got it.
Okay, I got that. So very good.
And if I could add to that, so it also aligns incentives. So if you think about it, incentives drive behavior. And once you align the incentives correctly, you get behavior really rapidly to change. So if you then define it as a software product, you really have only three things that this product needs to be able to do, which is make you money, save you money, or save lives in some other cases. Those are three things that a software product does. And if you then have product thinking with a service provider like ours, our incentive is then not to camp out on your budget and push as many hours as we possibly can. Our incentive is to make you money as quickly as possible, save you money as quickly as possible, or save lives. And that aligns everything so nicely that you can move very fast in very small iterations.
So you're a DC native here now, right? And you've been around where the crisis has happened in this area too. So I guess because of the nature of where we live, on that, any advice that you would give to people?
So these, I've lived through quite a number of crises, from the currency crisis of the 80s to the internet boom and bust. I was part of a pretty famous company here called MicroStrategy, where we grew the company extremely fast, and then we had to get rid of at least 2/3 of the team members as quickly as possible so that the company would survive. I remember the financial crisis, and in each one of those cases, let's pick the financial crisis just as an example of the 2008-2009 cycle. We as a company, and luckily for us, our customers, or some of our customers, used it as a chance to reboot and as a chance to strengthen how we come out of this crisis. So EastBanc Technologies didn't fire any of their team members. We did not lay off anybody. We didn't cut salaries. We actually hired the best of the people that we could get on the marketplace in preparation for the time when the crisis is over. And what we found was we had a lot of tools in our tool belt at the end of the crisis, we came out like John Wayne with all bullets flying, while all of our competitors that, in quotation mark competitors, were essentially dissipated and came out weaker. So this is a time to really innovate, use the time to innovate, use the time to transform yourself digitally, buy into this idea, which we now all experience, that the digitization of our life is a relentless force that we need to embrace and not fight. We were now forced to embrace it. Let's turn that into a positive and say we need to keep going and innovating around that, digital transformation that is inevitable. If we don't embrace it, we'll be the ones that are dead at the end of such a crisis.
If people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do that?
Best way is eastbanktech.com, EastBancTech.com. But I'm on LinkedIn. That's where we connected many years ago. Wolf Ruzicka at LinkedIn.
So
thank you, Lee.
Thank you for the time. I know it's crazy right now, and you making the time to do this. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Of course. My pleasure.